G'day and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, and people that have an intense passion for marine life. My name is Matt Testoni and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Jemina Stuart-Smith. She's a research fellow at the University of Tasmania and also a CSIRO affiliate and has worked with Red Maps. And today she's going to be talking all about handfish. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's good to be here.
So how did a passion for handfish start for you?
Well, I guess I started diving with them around 11 years ago. I was doing some volunteer work for a citizen science program called Reef Life Survey based here in Hobart, but they've really got global reach. And we were doing surveys at a site that was known to have red handfish, but they were thought to be in such low numbers and they were quite rare and quite cryptic. So we weren't really sure that we were going to find any. So my first encounter was diving along a transect line and searching amongst the reef, amongst seaweed, looking for these tiny little fish that I just didn't think I'd see. And I really clearly remember seeing my first one as I parted this seaweed, and it was just kind of sitting right there in front of me, looking up at me. And we had this moment where we just kind of had this standoff staring at each other. And that was kind of my first experience with handfish. And to be honest, I did a little bit more volunteering with handfish through a spotted handfish program here in Hobart as well. But then it had been kind of several years before I got back into it and started working with them again around about 2 years ago.
I love how you just, have an eye-to-eye encounter. I can just picture it now being like, whoa, it's staring at you, you're staring at it.
Yeah, it was a bit of a weird moment, but very cool. I mean, they're quite unusual looking. I guess they're interesting little sea creatures. They have these strange looking little fish with these modified sort of pectoral fins that they use to walk around on the seafloor rather than swimming. And their faces are quite unusual. They've been compared to creatures like toads, or this mix of like a toad and a fish. So they're kind of quite quirky and interesting looking.
Yeah. And so tell us what exactly they are, because they're a species of anglerfish, I believe, or how do they differ from normal anglerfish?
Yeah, so they're a small, rarely seen marine fish, and they dwell on the seafloor. They're quite small in that they measure no more than about 15 centimetres, and that's the biggest. Most are actually much smaller than that. And they comprise a family of 14 species, and they've changed very little in the last sort of 50 million years. So they're really an incredibly ancient lineage of fishes. But yeah, they're related to anglerfish, and they possess the rod and lure, or the elysium and the esker, which is the structure on top of their head that most people are familiar with from anglerfish. And for anglerfish, they use that for, as a fishing lure to attract prey, but we haven't actually readily observed that behaviour in handfishes, so we're not too sure. I mean, we assume that's what they use it for, but we haven't actually seen it. But on top of that, they lay eggs, so they have approximately somewhere between 80 and 250 eggs, depending on species, and they guard their eggs until hatching, which is several weeks.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool or unusual behaviour really for fish in general, isn't it? Hang around and guard their eggs.
Yeah, that's right. And it can be, with spotted handfish, it's around 6 to 8 weeks that they guard their eggs. So it's quite a long time to be sitting alongside a batch of eggs and be quite vulnerable to things that might be nearby. And when the babies hatch, or the juveniles hatch, they don't have a planktonic larval stage. So they just hatch as fully formed tiny little handfish. They're several millimetres long at that point and just sort of walk off into their new habitat.
That sounds like the cutest thing ever, because just to kind of get a picture, describe to us like what kind of colors they are and how big their hands are and stuff.
Yeah, so the main ones that I work on are the red and the spotted and the zeebles have been the focus of our research. And the red handfish, they're called red handfish, but they can be a variety of colours, sort of reds and pinks, and they don't have scales like traditional fish. They kind of have warty skin, and they have their pectoral fins, which are their hand-like protrusions, kind of sit at the bottom of their body, and they've got roundish faces with an upturned kind of frown. So very different looking fish. The spotted handfish, obviously a little bit bigger, the average size is, and they have spots or markings alongside of their bodies. And zeebles can be a variety of different colour morphs, but nobody's seen them for around, I think 15 years was the last time a zeebel's handfish was spotted.
Wow. Do you actively go out and look for the zeebles, or do you believe they're still there, or have they passed, unfortunately?
We're not too sure. I mean, we do have a lot of survey data, and we have actually run surveys, in particular through the Reef Life Survey program, that have targeted areas that they were last seen. And we know of divers that frequent areas that they were last seen, and none of them have seen them for that time. So we're really not too sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you mentioned just before, like they're kind of like, you kind of pull back something and there it is. So where do they actually sit and live within the reef?
Yeah, well, the red handfish and zeebles live on reefs. So the red handfish are sort of in quite shallow areas, so anywhere from a metre to 20 metres. Most of our the sites that we work out, they're really quite shallow. They're sort of between 1 and 5 metres. And they're just tucked in amongst seaweed and seagrass. So they really are on the bottom, on the seafloor. The spotted handfish are live in different habitats. So they're on sandy, silty areas just out in the Derwent estuary. A little bit easier to find if you're looking for handfish because you don't have to search amongst seaweed. The zeebles handfish are a little bit deeper. They get down to, I think it's maybe around 20 or 30 metres, but they're on sort of sponge kind of reefs.
Okay. And but correct me if I'm wrong, they form kind of colonies, do they? Or there's like congregations? They don't really move very far?
They definitely don't move very far, and that's one of the things that's kind of making it difficult for them. So as I mentioned, they don't have a planktonic larval stage, and their locomotion is by walking, so they really can't disperse very far. And they are in these kind of little patches, So the red handfish patches, are sort of the remaining areas are around, half the size of a soccer field, and they're all kind of in this one area. Spotted handfish are also kind of grouped in these little populations throughout the Derwent estuary and beyond.
What causes the boundary? Is there a set boundary that the handfish live in and they don't cross, or why aren't they growing bigger populations?
Yeah, for red handfish, it's quite clear. So the reef areas that they're in, they're bordered by, or they're being impacted by urchins. So native urchins have increased in those areas. They're eating the seaweed that the red handfish need for, to lay their eggs on and to shelter underneath. And so the urchins are effectively, I guess, forming these barrens either side of the population and kind of moving in. And we've been doing quite a bit of work around not just monitoring the urchins, but trying to keep numbers under check by doing removals. But yeah, it is quite a serious situation for the reds in that they are essentially running out of habitat because it's being consumed by urchins.
Yeah, and just briefly, I know can be a little bit controversial, but what is causing the urchin boom?
Well, typically you get, when you get released from predators, you get, increases in urchins. So, lack of large lobsters that eat urchins is a likely cause. I mean, we don't have exact data for the red handfish population areas, but that's certainly something that's likely impacting them.
And so, speaking of like urchins eating seaweed and stuff, what do handfish eat?
Well, we're not too sure. We know that they eat small invertebrates and mollusks, and I do have some records of, I think they're in captivity, red handfish eating other smaller fish, but we don't have any extensive, stomach content studies because most of the species are just so poorly known and understood.
Yeah, and I guess I just know from looking at other species of anglerfish, it is so hard to see them eating. It is something you'll never see because they just, as soon as they see you coming, they just hide away. The ultimate camouflager.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they are, that's the thing. They are ambush predators. So they just sit and wait for their prey to come by rather than actively moving around to find them. We have had some in captivity over the past year or so. And so we've been feeding them invertebrates, amphipods and stuff that we collect from the wild. So we have had the opportunity to watch them feed in there. And it's quite a slow process because they sort of sit there and wait for something to come right in front of them before they launch at it.
Yeah, so they're not actively walking around seeking stuff. They just kind of wait
absolutely.
and hide. And so you mentioned the red handfish is kind of hemmed in by this urchin barren. But what about the spotted handfish?
The spotted handfish is restricted to areas around the Derwent and D'Entrecasteaux Channel. They're in these sort of discrete populations, and they have, I think some of the factors that are impacting spotted handfish are similar and revolve around habitat degradation and a variety of factors around there. Historical fishing has likely impacted the habitat that they live in.
I have to ask, what are some so you got the zeebles?
Zeebles, yeah.
The red, the spotted. What are some of the other handfish that live around Tasmania? Because they are mainly around Tasmania and the south coast of Australia, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So they're all restricted to southeastern Australia, and most species are found only in Tasmania. Although it's hard to talk about them like that. So there's these 14 species. I don't think I mentioned before, but one of them has been listed as being extinct last year, which was the first marine bony fish family on the planet to ever be listed as extinct. So it was quite a significant milestone. And as for the rest of the 13 species, we've really only seen, I think, three in the past 15 years. So most of them we just don't have data, or we don't have records or information on. So it's quite difficult to know how to, I guess, to know how to properly conserve them if we can't study them.
Yeah, and so those other handfish, they're not seen commonly by researchers in like that part of Tasmania. Would there be bigger populations in less dived places, or are they just extremely rare?
Well, we're not too sure. So I guess the other handfish species, they're a mix of either deep or shallow water species, and they live on a variety of habitats. They're either reef orientated or sandy silty areas. But many of the species we don't have. I mean, I think 5 of the species are known from fewer than 5 records. So we just don't have a lot of information on them. 5 of the species that are left are listed as data deficient on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So we just don't have much information on them.
Yeah, and that's one thing I always talk about with people is that, land-based animals, it's so easy to quantify their populations, but ocean animals, you look and species that should be endangered or critically endangered, nothing happens because it just says data deficient.
Yes, it's certainly a lot harder to list species, marine species as extinct or any of the categories than it is for terrestrial, generally speaking. And with the data deficient category too, it in itself is a bit of a worry because it really inhibits our ability to implement appropriate conservation strategies. Just because it's data deficient doesn't mean that it's okay. It just means we have no idea what's going on.
And for the red handfish and the other handfish, what conservation strategies are we working on, and what is yourself and IMAS, Institute of Marine Antarctic Science, doing to help these animals?
Yeah, for red handfish, which is really the focus of my work and our priority at the moment, we're doing a whole bunch of things. Last year, we released a bunch of juvenile red handfish that we'd collected as eggs and kept in captivity at IMAS. We kept them for a year here at IMAS. We also had some that were up with one of our industry partners up at Seahorse World in northern Tasmania. And those juveniles were part of what's known as a head starting program. The head starting program the idea behind it is to bolster wild population numbers. And so while they're in captivity, you keep animals in captivity, they're protected from things that might impact their survival in the wild. There's no predators, there are no adverse environmental conditions. And so what we did was we kept them for a year and then released them back into the wild, which was a really significant moment, but also super stressful. I mean, the whole year itself was really stressful because we hadn't done this sort of work with red handfish, and because numbers are so critically low for red handfish, now we're thinking that the population size is fewer than 100 adults globally, So then taking eggs and keeping them into captivity in itself is a risk. So we did that last year. So we released, I think it was 42 juveniles back into the wild, and we're now going back to resurvey them regularly. And I can report that as of a few weeks ago, we found some that we'd released, and so that represents resighting individuals up to 70 days so far post-release, which is a really great sign. I mean, it's a great start, but we really need that long-term monitoring data if we are to know that the program's doing well. But on top of that, we're doing a whole bunch of things. We're continuing looking at urchin numbers and monitoring urchin numbers and implementing removals when needed.
Yeah, wow. And so over the 70 days, have the handfish grown much? And how do you know they're the ones that you released?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the actual size data yet for the ones that we've resighted, but as for how we know that they were ours, we have a couple of ways. First of all, we take photos of the sides of their bodies, and they have these spot patterns that are unique to individuals. We actually can track them like that in the wild. So we take a photo before they're released, or we take photos of them while they're in the wild. We've got a software package that we run that through, and it brings up, likely hits, and then we can match them. So we did that, but also with a subset of the juveniles, we inserted a small tag, which was kind of like a little tattoo on one side of the fish that we can use to make sure that, to double check that they're the ones that we released.
Wow, cool. And I have to ask, do you name the individuals with the spots, or are they just like handfish one?
No, we do. Well, initially they're just sort of numbered like that, but we launched a fundraising campaign around it a year or two ago for that reason, to sort of engage with the public, and because we knew that we could track individuals over time. So we launched this program to help generate interest, but also to generate funds. So the idea is that people can, name one of the handfish in the wild. And so people have been donating funds to be able to do that. And we've had some really funny ones. I think there's a fish named Irwin after Steve Irwin, and there's one called Uncle Marty after somebody's Uncle Marty. And so it's kind of nice to be able to report back on that and say, here's Uncle Marty that we haven't seen for the last 3 months kind of thing.
Do citizen scientists get out there and take photos of them for ID much, or is that something that will happen in the future?
For the ID part of it, it's actually generally through our research. So we've got a student here, Tyson Bessel at the University of Tasmania, who's doing a mark recapture as part of his PhD. So a lot of the recaptures or the resightings are for his work. So we've really been running that for the university. We do ask people to send in sightings of particularly red handfish. If people are to sight them in other areas, we're looking for that kind of information, and of course reporting things like, possible zebra sightings. So that's all really helpful.
Yeah, and I think we were chatting before the podcast. You mentioned there's 2 specific places where the red handfish live, and that's it.
Yeah, that's right. So that's all that we currently know. So they're both quite near to Hobart and quite near to each other. One of them is sort of the site that most locals know about, and people have been diving for red handfish there for years. And then in 2018, we received a community sighting and discovered a second population nearby.
Cool. Do you have any fun facts about handfish? I was looking and I came up almost with a blank. But anything fun or any cool stories or things you've observed with them, even in the lab?
So we had their eggs in captivity for a while, and the eggs are laid in like a cluster or a group, and they're connected by these fine filaments or like tendrils that are really thin and clear. It kind of looks like fishing line, and they kind of wrap their eggs around these structures. And anyway, we had these eggs in captivity, and we, got to kind of, once the eggs had hatched, we removed the empty egg cases, and the tendrils are actually super, super strong. Like, it was quite difficult to pull them apart, sort of thing. But on top of that, I think it's also really interesting, that the parents care for their eggs until hatching. And that in spotted handfish, we've observed evidence of egg guarding. So, sea stars and other animals will walk close, and the handfish will actually do some kind of fin flicks and kind of move over to try and defend their eggs almost.
Wow, that would be really cool behavior to see in the wild. Is that would be in the wild, I take it?
It is in the wild. And in captivity, we've kept the juveniles. So I told you we kept juveniles in captivity for a year, and we did also see some fin movements that were sometimes directed at us, I think, when we approached the tanks. And I don't know if that's some sort of form of aggression or something, but it was quite interesting, just dipping their sort of dorsal fins at us and that sort of thing.
Yeah, cool. If anyone is a diver or a snorkeler or something around Tasmania and they want to go look for handfish, what are some tips for finding them, even if you're not in a known location? What kind of tips would you have for them?
It's kind of a tough one because, like I said, only 3 species have been observed in the past 10 years. If you're looking for handfish, you need to move really slowly, stick to the seafloor and just move carefully along. The spotted handfish in the Derwent estuary is perhaps the easiest one to see. It's generally easy to find. They're out in the open and in these sandy, silty areas. As I mentioned, the red handfish, they're smaller, they're tucked away in reefs, and they're quite difficult to find. But if you're out there looking, take it slow, just move carefully and keep your eyes peeled.
Yeah, and just quickly, what kind of depth would you be like seeing them at usually?
Red and spotted, you're looking anywhere between 1 metre and sort of 20 metres. Spotted handfish get a bit deeper, but the red handfish can be quite shallow. I should have mentioned too that if you don't see them in the wild, you can actually see them in captivity at Sea Life Melbourne Aquarium and Seahorse World in Beauty Point in Tasmania. They're actually keeping those handfish as part of a captive breeding program that was initiated through the CSIRO.
Cool. And I know some fish or any animals can have trouble breeding in captivity. How are these ones going?
It's very difficult, actually. One of the tough things about it is that we can't tell males and females apart, so it's difficult to initiate a proper breeding program around that. So it's really been trial and error up until now. Sea Life Melbourne Aquarium, we were able to do some ultrasound of some adults that they had recently in their aquariums and figure out, which had eggs and which didn't, kind of thing. But it's something that we're trying to work on, providing the right sort of area and habitat and conditions for them to be able to breed.
Cool. And one last really nerdy marine question I have to ask is, if we can't physically see the difference between the genders, how do the handfish tell?
We're not too sure. There could be olfactory cues might be one of the things that they actually have quite large nostrils for the red handfish, to at least for the size of the fish. So we think that cues like that, olfactory cues, might be important in, finding each other and perhaps other mate selection as well. But yeah, we're not too sure at this point.
Well, let's I'll look forward to research in the next decade or two as to the sex of handfish. But thanks heaps for being on the show today. And if anyone wants to learn more about the work you do and the Handfish Project, where should they go and what should they do?
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. You can follow us we've got a website, handfish.org.au. We've got a Facebook page, just look for the Handfish Conservation Project, and on Twitter, we're at Handfish Project.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on. Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. You can see more of my photography on Instagram at Matt_Testoni_photography or on my webpage, mtunderwatermedia.com. If you like the show, please tell a friend and visit our Instagram page, Seacreatures_podcast, and visit our Patreon account, patreon.com/SeacreaturesPodcast. And that's where you can help support the show and maybe land some cool stickers. Production assistance by Georgia McGrath and music by the fantastic Dan Musil. You can hear more of his music by visiting Dan Musil Music on Instagram, all one word. Tune in next time to hear all about manta rays with Charlie and Duncan, two underwater photographers who spend a bit of time with the amazing creatures. This has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.